Hi, I'm Veronica, and welcome back to the Reading Chronicles. Here are the 7 books I read in April. The first book I read was The Odyssey, or I should say I reread The Odyssey, by Homer, translated by Robert Fagles. The poem is believed to have originally been written in the 7th or 8th century BC. This edition was published in 1996, and the story itself is 498 pages. I also listened to the audiobook, which is narrated by Sir Ian McKellen, and that's a little over 13 hours. Now, what can I say about the Odyssey? You probably know the story or are somewhat familiar with it, or maybe you had to read it in high school. But to sum it up, after 10 years of fighting in the Trojan War, the warrior Odysseus angers the god Poseidon and gets stranded with his crew, causing him to spend another 10 years trying to get back to his home of Ithaca, his wife Penelope, and his son Telemachus, for whom he's been absent since he was a baby. The poem starts with Athena asking Zeus to finally allow Odysseus to come home, then visiting Telemachus to visit him to set sail in search for his father. Meanwhile, a horde of suitors has been threatening the king's home, wishing to take his place by marrying Penelope, and they scheme to murder Telemachus when he returns back from his journey. Now, Penelope has been keeping the suitors at bay by insisting that she first needs to weave a shroud for Laertes, Odysseus's father, so he will be rightfully covered at the time of his death. What they don't know, but what is eventually revealed to them, is that Penelope has been undoing her weaving every night and has managed to stall the impending marriage for years in this way. The poem consists of 24 books, and it's not until book 5 that we finally meet Odysseus and start to hear his own recounting of the time he spent trying to get back to Ithaca. This includes defeating the Cyclops Polyphemus, Poseidon's son, which resulted in the god cursing him and sending him to drift about for another 10 years. He also encounters the witch Circe, who turns some of the members of his crew into pigs. I'm sure you're probably familiar with Madeline Miller's retelling of the Odyssey from Circe's point of view, a book that proved to me once again that just because it's popular doesn't mean it's bad. Odysseus is also tied to the mast of his ship so he can hear the siren songs but not be drawn astray by them, and he ventures to the land of the dead to hear the prophecy from the blind Tiresias. Later, his crew angers the god Helios by slaughtering the animals on his island, and Odysseus is the only one remaining. He ends up washed up on Ogygia, where he remains imprisoned as Calypso's lover. Odysseus does eventually return to Ithaca. Spoiler alert, if you can spoil a centuries-old story. Correct that, millennia-old story. And with his cunning ways, he defeats all of the suitors who have descended upon his kingdom, revealing himself to be the man that Penelope married. I didn't remember this part being quite so violent, but it really is quite a bloodbath, and it's portrayed well in the movie The Return with Ralph Fiennes and Juliette Binoche, and I think it'll be equally entertaining in Christopher Nolan's version of the story. Now, I didn't read the Odyssey in high school. I only read the Iliad. Well, I was supposed to read the Iliad, but I can assure you that 12th grade me was not at all interested in epic Greek poetry. But I did buy a box set and endeavored to read them after grad school when one of my professors told me that the Robert Fagles edition was particularly good. You've probably noticed this nice box set sitting on the shelf behind me. I think it was the same professor who also told me that the Odyssey was narrated by Ian McKellen, and I can tell you that listening to it while reading it really is the way to go. These stories were meant to be spoken after all, and Ian McKellen does a fantastic job of performing the story with intonation and inflection that are completely absent when you just read the words on the page. Listening to this story definitely helped me understand it better, and it's also nice hearing a proper pronunciation of all of those Greek names. I've only read this book once, and it has to have been over 10 years ago, and I reread it now because I wanted to be more familiar or renewed in my familiarity with the story before going to see Christopher Nolan's upcoming film. I can say that I'm even more excited to see it come to the screen, and I may attempt to give the Iliad another go. 5 stars for this classic read. The next book I read was Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata, translated from the Japanese by Ginny Tapley Takemori, published in 2016, 172 pages. This is a book that I've heard various booktubers and podcasters talk about, but it was also recommended to me by one of my students from Japan, so that definitely increased my interest in reading it. And the title of the book basically says it all. The story focuses on 36-year-old Keiko Furukura, who's been working in the same convenience store since she was 18. For her, the convenience store provides a sense of order, a way for her to put on the mask of normality and pretend to be just another cog in the societal machine. Her family has always worried about her, and at a young age, she decided that she would no longer do anything of her own accord and instead mimic what everyone else was doing so that she would appear normal. We see this when Keiko adopts the speaking patterns and styles of dress of her co-workers, but we most see this in her dating life, or rather her lack thereof. Although the terms aren't used, Keiko is asexual and aromantic and has no interest in dating or getting married or having children beyond the need to push nosy friends and family off her back. And I could 100% relate to this. I'm fortunate that my family has never pressured me about these things, but being confronted by people who try to unlock the mystery of your singlehood or insist that there's still time for you to have babies is not foreign to me. There's a part in the story where Keiko's sister and her friends are doing the shared woman thing of complaining about men. The one they're talking about doesn't have a job and seems to just laze around at home with little ambition, but they still insist on him being a worthwhile partner because those kinds of men tend to be kinder, more sincere, and charming, and they insist that getting pregnant is the best thing with a guy like him because it'll change him. To which I had to say, what? Why is being with a guy who does nothing preferable to being by oneself? And why does being in a bad relationship make one normal, but being mostly happy by oneself make one a case to be fixed? There are some definite differences between Keiko and me, just as the words asexual and aromantic are never used. Neither are the words autistic or neurodivergent, although Keiko is written in a way to suggest that those descriptors would be appropriate. And none of those 4 items could describe me. However, I could definitely empathize with the feeling of having to perform in a certain way in society and having the right sorts of reactions even if they don't match your insides, and how that can be a bit exhausting. In the end, not a whole lot changes for Keiko, but what she learns is that she's happiest being who she is, and that's a convenience store woman. Keiko need not have a man by her side, a baby on her hip, or a job that's more glamorous than that. And I loved her for it. I gave this book 4.5 stars. The next book I read was Páradais by Fernanda Melchor, published in 2021, 158 pages. This was published under the same name in English and translated by Sophie Hughes. The book was also longlisted for the International Booker Prize in 2022. What kind of trouble could two teenage boys in the middle of a luxury residential community get up to? Turns out, a lot. Franco is living there with his grandparents, feeling lonely, eating junk food, lazing about, and lusting after the new community member, Marianne Moronio. Polo, on the other hand, is the groundskeeper from a nearby working-class town, and he's tasked not only with the usual duties of keeping the pool clear of debris and cleaning up after children's parties, but also with the tasks that his belittling boss thrusts upon him, such as washing his car every day. Franco can do nothing but talk about how much he wants to screw Marianne, to the point where Polo questions whether he's actually had sex with anyone, and Polo is desperate to leave his home where he lives with his abusive mother and pregnant and seemingly sex-obsessed cousin Zoraida. Franco and Polo aren't quite friends, but the agony and torment of their respective situations bring them together and lead them to hatch a plan from which neither of them will be able to return. They may literally be in paradise, but they are far from the figurative meaning of that word. In this novella, Melchor paints the picture of two highly unlikable individuals, each one believing that he's owed far much more in life than he deserves. Marianne is married and has children, and on top of that is a grown adult, and there's no reason for Franco to think he should have a chance with her. Polo seems to be a bit more sympathetic in the beginning. His mother is the one who forced him to get the job as a groundskeeper and berates him regularly, calling him an idiot and saying he'll end up like his delinquent cousin Milton who's gone missing. And Polo misses his grandfather fiercely, but he only seems sympathetic until we learn about everything that Polo's trying to escape from, and he's far from the innocent boy with the bad family that he believes himself to be. Melchor's writing has an interesting, quick pace to it, not in the sense that we typically think of in a thriller or something of that genre, but in the sense that she strings together these long sentences, sometimes the length of an entire page, as a way of pushing the reader through the action. And this is never more evident than in the story's climax, where a single sentence covers almost a full 9 pages. This might sound disorienting, but because the action is so engaging, it's really only noticeable if you're someone like me who pays attention to that sort of thing. And while the middle portion of the book dragged a bit for me, it's bookended by this weird relationship between these two boys, their unfounded confidence in themselves, born from a culture of masculine violence, as well as this boneheaded plan that they aim to carry out. While it was sometimes hard to read their thoughts regarding the women in their lives, that's only because such thoughts ring true. I'm glad to have discovered a new-to-me Spanish language author, and she's not from Spain, she's from Mexico, and I plan to read more of Melchor in the future. I gave the book 3.5 stars. The next book I read was Lost Ark Dreaming by Suyi Davies Okungbowa, published in 2024, 175 pages. I found this book while looking at the list of Nebula Award nominees for the year, and this speculative fiction novella set on the west coast of Africa and focusing on the survivors of the rising of the Atlantic Ocean caught my eye. Set decades after this catastrophic event that forced people to live inside a partially submerged 5-building high-rise known as the Fingers, the story focuses on 3 people, Yakini, Ngozi, and Tuoyo, who, like so many others, have lost loved ones to the event and now live in the building which they call both their home and workplace. Yakini is an analyst for the Commission for the Protection of the Fingers, and when she's called to go on her first undersea mission, she's introduced to Ngozi, a mid-level administrator in the Office of the Pinnacle Leadership. Pinnacle being the name for the tallest of the 5 fingers, reaching over a kilometer high. The task brings them down to the lower levels, which are completely submerged, and it's there that they meet Tuoyo, foreman and head of safety on level 9. Their task is to investigate a hole in an airlock wall and determine what caused it and if it could possibly be one of the mysterious creatures they call the Children. The story is essentially an allegory for climate change, social stratification, and rampant discrimination, which makes it like so much other speculative fiction that has come before it. The Fingers were originally designed to be a series of luxury high-rises in Lagos, where the ultra-rich could satisfy their every need within. Grocery stores, pharmacies, fitness centers, restaurants, and even more businesses signed up to occupy the retail spaces on the many floors. And parents could even watch their children ride on bikes on trails in the building's halls. Even as the buildings are being constructed in 2034, the idea of flood-proof levels is in mind, with the developers saying that they need to prepare for all possible futures, but that it's not for them to worry about. It's the concern of all those in the city of Lagos who will not be able to afford to plan for their survival should such a massive flooding come to the city. Of course, that's exactly what happened, and many of these people were washed out to sea, never to be seen again, or so everyone thinks. Told from the perspectives of the 3 principal characters, plus short interjections from media and government reports that help us see how the government failed to protect the most vulnerable during this extreme moment of environmental change, the story suffers a bit from being a bit too short to fully develop the idea of the mystical children, while also delving into the real history of Nigeria and how its land and people have been exploited for the benefit of the rich. I didn't get a full sense of what the children wanted beyond being acknowledged and not being feared, which works decently as a symbol for the oppressed people governments would like their more affluent citizens to fear and forget. I would have also liked more examination of the social stratification within the buildings, with middlers like Ngozi and Yakini looking down on the lowers like Tuoyo. It's a decent setup for the best kind of speculative fiction that takes our current world to an extreme to show the existing biases and how they would be exacerbated in times of crisis. But it veers a bit too much toward the mystical at the end for my taste, and I was left feeling like I just wanted to know more about these 3 individuals, their families, and how they ended up in the social positions they were in. That would be a lot to cover in 175 pages, and I suppose the novella does just fine on its own, but I couldn't help wanting more. I gave it 3 stars. My next book was The Running Man by Stephen King, published in 1982, 345 pages. Now, I'm not a big reader of Stephen King. I've read The Gunslinger and 11/22/63, both of which left me disappointed, with the latter making what I consider to be the cardinal sin of purporting to be a sci-fi story, but really being a love story. But with the upcoming movie version of The Running Man, slated for later this year, and starring Glenn Powell, I thought I'd give King another try with this book. In short, my thoughts on King haven't changed. The Running Man is set in a future dystopian world not too far from our current present, which I always find amusing. And in this world, people are desperate for the basic necessities, and they compete on reality shows to earn what they need to survive. Ben Richards is one of these people. With his infant daughter Kathy sick with the flu, he needs to find some way to get her the medicine she needs, and he decides to sign up for the show that bears the book's title. The show is one in which the participant is hunted on live TV, earning a certain amount of money for every hour that he's able to stay alive, with the promise of earning $1 billion if he makes it to 30 days. Of course, no one's ever made it to 30 days, but that doesn't stop people from trying. The premise is simple enough, and while it's not particularly original, this is essentially the reality TV version of the 1924 story, The Most Dangerous Game by Richard Connell, that's not what bothered me. I know it's not fair to judge earlier works by today's standards, but it's also difficult to be a modern reader and not find all of the glaring instances of racism, sexism, and homophobia difficult to stomach. I can handle it in much older works where the language is clearly a product of its time, or when it's present because it adds something to the story or tells us something about the characters, but when it's just casually thrown in, I find it much more disruptive. Was it okay to just say the N-word casually in 1982? I was a baby then, so I don't remember. I'm certain that it was still okay to throw around homophobic slurs because that continued well into my 20s, but their presence here adds nothing to the story. Like, why is Ben obsessed with looking at this guy's butt? Maybe that says something more about Ben than anything else. Of course, many of the women in the story are developed little beyond being walking breasts and genitals that are waiting to be taken advantage of by men. Ben literally gets mad at a woman and has to resist the urge to rape her. How is that an appropriate response to anything? There's also way too much focus on a character being fat, and that felt ridiculous. I don't think the problem is that we're much more sensitive to these things nowadays. The problem is that this is lazy writing. In lieu of creating fully developed characters that the reader can champion, they are imbued with some of the basest beliefs about people who are different, in the assumption that the reader will be able to identify with them this way. It's just another tick in the box that the default human is straight, white, male, and possesses a body size that's considered to be acceptable. I need my writing to be more imaginative than that. I found it hard to care whether Ben completed his mission because he's boring and basic. I'll still see the movie because A, it has Glenn Powell, and B, it's 2025 and I would be surprised if those elements were kept in. The question is, do I read more Stephen King? I've always wanted to read The Stand, but that is 1,000 pages of his writing by someone whose books I've yet to enjoy. Any recommendations? I gave this book 3 stars. Next, I read The Housemaid by Freida McFadden, published in 2022, 325 pages. Despite its rampant popularity, I decided to read this book because the movie version is coming out on Netflix later this year, and as with The Running Man, I always try to read the book if I'm even a little bit interested in seeing the movie. To my great surprise, I actually didn't hate it. That doesn't mean it wasn't in parts kind of stupid and 100% predictable, but I didn't hate the experience of reading it. Millie is our titular housemaid who is eager to get a job after having lost her previous one, getting evicted from her apartment, and having had to spend her time in her car, including sleeping in it. She desperately needs a job in order to comply with the requirements of her parole, which lets us know that she spent some time in prison, but we don't yet know why. With a doctored resume and wearing glasses to make herself less attractive. Okay, but can we just stop with the idea that wearing glasses makes someone unattractive, particularly women? This is part of the stupidity I'm talking about. This is coming from someone who's worn corrective lenses since, like, 2nd grade. Like, why don't we just also give her curly hair? Because that is also hideous on women. Anyway, I obviously have some personal thoughts about that. Millie aces her interview with Nina Winchester and will begin to cook and clean for the family, running errands for them, and also occasionally dealing with the couple's belligerent, spoiled brat of a child, Cecilia. It's a live-in position, which is good for Millie since she has no home, but the living quarters turn out to be a small room in the attic with a thin cot, a small refrigerator, and a window that's been painted shut. Oh, and a door that sometimes gets stuck, but that's all fine because Millie is so desperate to finally have a place to sleep. That isn't her car. Of course, Nina turns out to be the boss from hell, leaving food around the house, covering the bathroom mirror with smudges and the sink with toothpaste residue, and throwing fits when Millie forgets information that Nina never told her. Millie soon comes to wonder what happened with the put-together woman who interviewed her and how she could possibly be married to the devastatingly handsome Andrew. Oh, there's also a really hot gardener who barely speaks English because, of course, there is. What happens next is not a surprise, nor is the supposed twist. And even though the writing is juvenile and Millie reads like the most naive person on earth with the worst decision-making skills, I can't say I wasn't mildly compelled to continue reading to find out how the story put together all of the things that I knew were going to happen. I'm honestly surprised by my reaction to it and don't really understand why I didn't like it less than I did, but I guess it serves as a decent palate cleanser and is perfectly fine as long as you're not expecting too much. I might even read the sequels. I gave it 3.5 stars. My last book was The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro, published in 1989. 245 pages. As with Ishiguro's other books, I'll give a more thorough look at this Booker Prize winning classic in a separate video. Suffice it to say that this novel follows the reminiscences of the Butler Stevens as he takes a drive through England and remembers his time spent serving Lord Darlington, particularly in the years leading up to World War II. The main question here, as with Ishiguro's previous two books, is whether Stevens can justify the choices he's made in his life and whether he's worthy of the most honored adjective and praise of being dignified and possessing dignity. This book is worth every bit of praise that has been heaped upon it, and I look forward to finally seeing the Oscar-nominated movie that's based on it. Have you read any of these books? What were your thoughts? And should I read more of Stephen King? Let me know in the comments. That's all from me today. I hope you read well.